Since antiquity, trade has shaped successive civilizations, stimulated innovation, and underpinned the modes of production. With economic downward pressures and multilateral systems facing greater challenges, how can the globalized trade system help defend against a global downturn? Where is the current multilateral framework heading? And with unilateralism threatening underdevelopment, how can the Belt and Road Initiative help multilateralism thrive? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Richard Kojo-Wright, Director of the Division on Globalization and Development, Strategies of the UN Conference of Trade and Development, and Professor Ju Jiandong, Unigroup Chair Professor at the PBC School of Finance at Tsinghua University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. First of all, Richard, what do you think are the core issues concerning globalization when you look at your own job, which is to help write reports on, development as well as trade strategies?
We are worried, I think, is the short answer. Multilateralism is under stress. You talked about the trade tensions. But we're seeing it with migration problems. We're seeing it, of course, with the climate challenges. And at the same time, we're seeing a weakening of the global economy. The economy has shown weaker performance than was expected over the course of the last 6 months. And the combination of a weak multilateral system and a weakening global economy produces tensions of one kind or another. And we have to ask some very serious questions, I think, about whether the current makeup of the multilateral rules and institutions can really handle these problems going forward. So we are quite concerned about the current state of the global economy and the multilateral system.
Jiandong, despite grave concerns by Richard, who somehow represents a multilateral body of the United Nations, why do you think, in sharp contrast against this dark picture, we have the very strong economic recovery of the U.S. And we see very strong job market in the United States? Does it mean that unilateralism will have to take place at the cost of multilateralism?
Recall about 20-some years ago in 1990s, when we discussed a lot about the so-called regionalism and multilateralism on the globalizations. There are two driving forces on globalizations. One is like about WTO, but at that moment, WTO was the GATT discussion was struggling. But then we observed NAFTA, we observed the EU, which helped the WTO established in 1990s. I think the globalization is experiencing a structural change, which in two dimensions. One dimension is probably regionalism, which may be stronger than the multilateralism, which WTO. That's number one direction. Second of all, we also observe the structure change from, let's say, manufactured goods to service goods, investment and these intellectual property rights, and also this kind of a technology market, which is essential for these globalizations. So I'm not quite concerned about that. I think it is at the point to observe this structure change that probably will tell us the globalization go to the different directions.
I would be cautious about saying that the U.S. economy is in really good shape. The recent growth, which resulted from the tax cuts of the Trump administration, is almost certainly wearing thin. You have very weak wage growth still in the United States. Productivity performance since the financial crisis has not really picked up to the extent that the U.S. expected. Infrastructure spending is weak. I think there's some very serious problems underlying some short-term buoyancy in the first quarter of this year in the U.S. I think the U.S. economy has more systemic and underlying problems than many people imagine.
But President Trump has been talking triumphantly about the robust economic recovery on so many occasions to perhaps arouse public attention and lay groundwork for his second term in the White House. Now, China has been the world's second largest trading nation. As China posted slower growth last year, many are worried that continued downward pressure on the world's second largest economy could drag global growth. Do you share this concern, Jiandong?
First of all, I would share Richard's concern. I also
about the U.S. economic performance.
Yes, I also am not that optimistic about the U.S. economy. I think that probably next year we will see some down pressures on the U.S. economy as well. So for China, usually many people would think this year would be probably improved year. Well, second half year would be better. Certainly, I definitely agree the globalization structural change, the trade environment change will actually has a strong impact on China, so which I agree. But as I pointed before, these regional integrations, like Belt and Road integrations, and also like the better, strong connections for China to the Asian countries, probably will help a lot.
And what about the internal driving force for China's economic growth? For example, innovation, urbanization, increase in service industry, and the rise in productivity, hopefully. Do you think when the Chinese government engineers a shift from export-led growth, investment-led growth, to much of the domestic consumption, we won't see much of the curse that many of the economists predict? For example, taking Q1 performance of the Chinese economy as an example, it's better than we have expected, right, Richard? It's
better than expected, and overall, as you said, the Chinese economy's growth rate compared with much of the rest of the world continues to impress. But China now faces this struggle of moving into a middle-income economy. A lot of economists worry about this problem of what they call a middle-income trap, where countries get stuck with an existing pattern of production which it's difficult to upgrade and diversify away from a dependence on cheap labor, away from a dependence on a foreign market. So China now faces that. You have the Manufacturing 2025, which is an attempt to move away and upgrade and move into these new sectors, robotics and artificial intelligence, electric cars, etc. And I think that will be the big challenge facing China moving forward. It requires a shift of policy. It requires more focus on innovation than has been the case in the past. It's a difficult. We've seen many developing countries that have grown quickly through cheap labor and labor-intensive manufacturing get stuck at this level of development. So it will be a challenge for China. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think the Belt and Road initiative is a necessary complementary part of China's efforts, not only to upgrade internally, but also to find complementary economic ties with countries within the region and indeed beyond the region. So we are optimistic about the opportunities for China, but we understand that this is a challenging moment for policymakers in the country.
What do you think of the enormous efforts by the Chinese authorities to further open up its capital market? Same efforts have been made to prevent systematic financial risks, plus issues of local debts. These combined together may effectively prevent the Chinese economy from moving forward as rapidly as it has, with double-digit growth through much of the last 30 years.
I think the central issue is technology. High-tech industries. I'm not that concerned about the normal manufactured goods. Actually, I think the central conflicts and central issues between China and the U.S. and between other countries too. It's how do we regulate it? How do we create a free and competitive technology markets? Given currently the issues we observed, for examples, the U.S. and other countries prohibit to export technology to China, and at the same time require China to protect strongly on the property rights, the intellectual property rights, and at the same time also on open the markets. I'm really concerned about that issue. That as China becoming moving forward, and we have observed the structure change from the traditional goods to high-tech industries, then what would be the regulations in the entire world for free competitive technology trade? That becomes the central issues.
Many Americans start reflecting upon what went wrong with their policy of engagement over the past 4 decades since the Carter administration. And therefore, a lot of debates in the United States are focused on the future of WTO. It seems President Trump is keen on pulling out of many multilateral institutions, from the climate change, from NAFTA, the TPP. Then, are you optimistic about the prospects of keeping WTO alive with the growing momentum of unilateralism and the rise of populism in so many parts of the world?
I mean, as I said at the beginning, obviously we have real concerns, but as you rightly point out, a lot of those concerns come from failures within the advanced economies to get their own economic house in order. I don't think it's just a question of the US economy. I think the European economy, for example, is in many respects in more troubled shape than the US economy. And I think there's been a tendency, rather than to look at their own faults, and a number of the kinds of policies that these countries have followed since the financial crisis have not helped stimulate a strong and robust recovery. These are domestic policy failures in the US and in Western Europe. And until they find a more balanced economic strategy, there will be always tension, a tendency to blame China. And things that we know are clearly incorrect. I mean, Trump uses the size of the US trade deficit and blames it on China, whereas in fact most of the problems with the deficit have to do with internal domestic policies. He blames China's technological competition on China stealing American technology, for which there is very little evidence at all. So I think it will be very important moving forward that the main advanced economies get their own house in order and begin to provide the kinds of jobs and wage growth and productivity performance that can underpin a more harmonious international economic environment. So I think that should be the focus of a lot of our attention on why the advanced economies have not been able to generate the kind of economic performance that can support this kind of global interactions that we all believe are a necessary part of a healthy international environment.
Yes, you are right, Richard. Perhaps when you look at the campaign pledges of those populist leadership in democracies, putting their house back in order is part of the blame game, with China being singled out in the crusade. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Richard Wright and Professor Ju Jiandong. We are discussing negative impact of globalization and what would happen to free trade, with a particular focus on the prospects of the WTO. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Now, let's take a look at the changing world economic order. We are all aware of the post-war economic order, which is characterized very much by, of course, the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, GATT. Later on, it morphs into the WTO. But today, no one underestimates the consequences arising from unilateralism and protectionism. They rises on the platform of populist sentiments. It's a kind of backlash historically. It won't do multilateral free trade any good any longer. The Chinese authorities are level-headed about this part of consequences. So what do you think of the next stage for the world economic order? And naturally, one major question arises about the impact of a BRI. The second BRI Forum for International Cooperation took place in Beijing successfully. Xi Jinping, our president, is very proud of the global impact of his vision. So what do you think of international perspectives regarding BRI in terms of fine-tuning the world economic order, if not utterly replacing it with something new? That's something that truly worries President Trump.
I mean, I think President Xi should be rightly proud of the direction that the Belt and Road is going. But let me just step back a little bit on the origins of multilateralism. I think there's a tendency to believe that the multilateralism of the last 30 years is simply a continuation of what was created in 1945 and 1946 at the beginning. And it's not really the case. I think multilateralism changed very fundamentally in the 1970s and the 1980s. In the old model of multilateralism, which was very mission-oriented, focused on jobs and on building productive capacity, giving countries enough policy space to be able to manage their economies effectively, and very importantly, controlling capital. Because there was a belief coming out of the interwar period that the free flow of capital, if not regulated properly, would be a very disruptive force. So to have good trade, you needed to control capital. What happened in the 1970s and the 1980s was that capital was unregulated, both at home and abroad, and as a consequence has become a very disruptive force in the shaping of the global economy over the last 20, 30 years. So we are experiencing a very different kind of multilateralism today than what the originators of multilateralism wanted. And China is very interesting in this, because China, in its successful opening up, has opened up to trade and investment, but has been much more cautious about opening up to international capital, and in our opinion, rightly so. And I think that's an important lesson that the Belt and Road Initiative needs to understand. You have to have the right balance between trade, technology, investment, financial flows, if you're going to get a stable and inclusive growth dynamic that works for all partners in that kind of multilateral exercise. So
There's no question about the governmental rhetoric on the Chinese side regarding greater inclusiveness of BRI, or introduced by BRI in all likelihood. Jiandong, with regard to capital control, Richard put his hand on the issue of a tight control on the capital market, capital account, which has not been fully opened up, despite further opening up and external pressure. The other thing is that the Chinese authorities have tightened grip on the outbound flight of capital. Will that impact our investment in the infrastructure of developing countries that benefit from the BRI?
Okay, so let me quickly go back to your question, and then I get back to the capital account management, capital flow management of this question. I think that's a very, very important question as well. Go to the world order. Richard mentioned the world order. I think the old or the world order people usually call it's the U.S. lead world order. So U.S. as a major country create or made a strong, very significant impact on this existing world rule, world order, WTO, IMF, the World Bank, etc. So with the U.S. capacity, U.S. GDP as the share of the world GDP sharply declines, where does this world order go? We can just easily observe the facts. I think the fact looks like The European is centered on Germany and the U.S., and the Americans are centered on U.S., Canada, and Mexico. But China is the Asia. China has the largest market. So it looks like the world order is going to coexistence of multipolar systems like the U.S., Germany, France, and China. So I think, so to go back to your question, I think what China as my opinion, well, let's say that my individual opinions, China does not want to replace the U.S. to lead the world system. No. China just based on the facts to fit in what has been growing in the world, like this tripolar system. I think probably the tripolar systems would help. So that I get you first question. Go to the capital flow management. For China and for developing countries, we have actually a puzzle or called dilemma or trilemma. U.S. currency, dollars, and the Fed actually play the role for these world central banks. However, the interest, U.S. Fed does not put the world interest as their target. So it is natural for other countries to manage the capital flow cross borders. So currently, I think China is managing these capital flows and actually try to reduce the risk. I do think there is a strong need to reform China's international financial systems, which include to make these capital flow management more transparent, more rule-based, and more flexible. I do think it is a concern for the capital flow management in China, and we need to improve that system and to prevent the financial crisis on the one hand, but however, we also need to create an efficient and free flow the capital market.
Whether we would agree to further open up the capital account, Richard, I'm afraid largely depends on the controversial issue of pegging RMB to the US dollar. That sort of a pegging has led to much of the financial chaos previously. Do you think China will bear this in mind and try to avoid associating RMB with this major world reserve currency?
I mean, the renminbi is becoming slowly a reserve currency. I think that's clear. But at the moment, the dollar dominates international finance. The idea that there's a tendency to think that the U.S. and Trump plays to this has somehow lost its position in the world order. But if you look at the two most important levers of world power, military and finance, the U.S. is as strong as it's ever been. I think it's very important to recognize that fact. And we've constantly argued in the work that we have done at the UN is that the rise of the dominance of international finance under what is called the exuberant privilege of the dollar, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, sorry, has not, for many developing countries that have opened up very rapidly, produced a healthy environment. I'm sure, as you know, there's a lot of talk and a lot of worries about what is called debt diplomacy in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, and Western policymakers have accused China of using debt to ensnare developing countries into their geopolitical games. That's the accusation that's made. In fact, the problems of debt in the developing world have been due almost exclusively to the way in which international credit markets have been organized since the 1980s under both multilateral and private financial initiatives that come from the advanced economies. So again, you see this kind of shifting of the blame to China of a problem that has been actually created within the Western world itself. And I think when China, as China develops the Belt and Road Initiative, it does have to be conscious of the failure of the existing multilateral system to help to do two things. One is to help to diversify the economies of developing countries. Too many of them have continued to depend on commodities for their both for their growth and for their
Hence the commodity curse.
Exactly, the commodity curse, and the dependence of too many economies on external debt. So both of these have created tensions within the developing world, not due to China at all, but due to the limits of the existing multilateral system. But as China, I think, as the Belt and Road Initiative moves forward, I think it has to be very cognizant that it doesn't want to reproduce those two problems in the partners in which it engages.
Yes, indeed. The military might as well as financial powers of the United States remain as strong, as resilient as ever. Having said this, Europeans and Indians, even not Japanese and Chinese, may have realized the consequences of these depending on US dollar excessively. Therefore, Europeans have taken action to reform, if not to set up their own SWIFT mechanism in international trade settlement after Iran nuclear deal has been reversed by the White House. That means, of course, the reversal means the punishment of whatever multinationals, European in particular, will be punished should they continue to deal with the Iranian business entities. What about, say, cross-border payment? With China being in the first-tier leadership using online payment and e-commerce, which thrives so tremendously in China, what do you think of costs of cross-border currency transfer? Do you think digital technology will help close the gap between developing countries and the industrial nations?
I would agree with my colleague. I think regional solutions to these problems are likely to emerge. We've already seen regional payments unions emerging in the case of the European. You've got elements of that in some parts of Latin America. There's talk of this in Africa. Africa has recently signed a continental free trade agreement. That raises all kinds of payments issues that I think will require appropriate institutional mechanisms to support that. I think we're beginning to see that. The ASEAN group has not really found. You've had Chiang Mai initiative, which looking to form regional payment kind of arrangements, but it's quite underdeveloped, I think. But I think there will be a tendency to move towards more robust regional payment type mechanisms, precisely for the reasons that have been talked about earlier. We expect that to happen. Yeah.
Given millions of migrant workers who have to remit their money to homeland one way or another, currency transfers would thrive, but the costs of such currency transfers would be a heavy burden for migrant workers or the disadvantaged groups the world over. China tells the success story on the basis of the change of skylines, and much of that is changed by migrant workers who flock from the underdeveloped areas to the more prosperous regions in China. That's the China story, if not the China solution. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.